Good afternoon, and welcome to the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute's special live stream conversation on Millennials, Gen Z, and COVID-19, featuring experts from the Pew Research Center. Today we have with us Kim Parker and Richard Fry. Kim is Director of Social Trends Research at Pew Research Center. She oversees research on emerging social and demographic trends, manages major survey projects, and writes and edits reports. Prior to joining Pew, she worked as a research associate at the American Enterprise Institute. She holds a master's degree in American government from Georgetown and a bachelor's degree from Trinity College. Kim, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Richard Fry, a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. He is an expert on school and college enrollment in the United States, as well as the returns to education in the labor market and marriage market and its connection to household economic well-being such as net worth. He has extensive expertise analyzing U.S. Census Bureau and other federal data collections. Fry received his doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Richard.
Glad to be with you.
All right, we're going to jump right in here with some questions about our topic. So to get started, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the impact on millennials and Generation Z. For those who might not be familiar, can you explain the difference between millennials and Gen Z?
Sure. So the way that we define millennials is we consider them people who were born between 1981 and 1996. So that means this year they'll be ranging in age from 24 to 39. And then members of Gen Z are those born after 1996. So they are, the oldest among them are turning 23 this year. We don't know what the lower boundary will be yet, but generations usually span about 15 years or so. So we're guessing that the youngest Gen Zers are probably around 8 years old right now. And I should say at the outset that this is not an exact science at all. We find these sort of loose definitions very useful in terms of understanding cohorts of Americans and how their experiences and attitudes are shaped by the time in which they grow up and come of age. But there's definitely variety within these generations. They're not monolithic at all. And you might find that the youngest millennials are very similar to the oldest Gen Zers. So it's just important to keep in mind that this is, it's a very useful tool for understanding society and societal change, but it's not meant to be an exact science at all. And I can say a little bit about why we study generations, if that's useful for people, or do you want to just dive right into the COVID stuff?
Sure, no, go ahead. I mean, it's always in the news of, boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z. So why do we think of it that way?
Yeah, so it's important when we do this kind of research, we always try to distinguish between just looking at age groups versus looking at generations, because when you're looking at an age group, you're really seeing where they are in the life cycle. And so you might say that young people don't turn out to vote at the rate that older people do, but that's mainly because they're more transient, they're not as settled, their political views might not be fully formed. So it's not because of the generation to which they belong, it's more because of the stage of life that they're at. But there are other things in, big experiences that have an imprint on a generation, whether it's technological change or a historical event like 9/11, or growing up in a particular political environment. So to use the millennials as an example, they all have 9/11 as part of their memory. That was something that formed them, and the world changed significantly after that event. And in terms of their political socialization, they've come of age in a very extremely polarized political environment. So they approach politics, from that unique perspective. And then some of the things another thing that we're going to talk about a lot today, I think, is the economy and the economic environment. And many millennials were coming of age and entering the labor market at a very challenging time in the throes of the Great Recession and in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So that was something that shaped their initial entry into adulthood. And it's something that, as Rick will talk about later, still has an impact on them now.
Very good. So now let's jump into millennials. You already just gave a really good overview of kind of defining moments of the generation, but and the Great Recession. So let's dive into how were millennials faring economically before the current crisis began? How do they compare to prior generations on levels of wealth, home ownership, savings, debt, income, things like that?
Yeah, we have monitored that closely for well over 10 years. And as of 2018, 2019, a national unemployment rate of about 3% nationally, and we were towards the top of the business cycle. So the numbers are going to cite you are sort of for when it was sort of the best for this younger millennial generation. All of the figures I'm going to mention are adjusted for inflation. But before I get into the going through the numbers, I'll just sort of, basically it's a mixed bag. It partly depends on, are we looking at earnings, what they make in the labor market? Are we looking at their household incomes? Are we looking at their wealth levels? And sort of quickly, the picture for their earnings is they're doing okay relative to earlier generations. Household income, they were actually doing pretty good. And on household wealth, they were clearly lagging behind. So here we go. Let's first turn to sort of millennials, each individually themselves, how they were doing in the labor market. This is for full-time workers. A millennial working full-time was making about, median was making about $41,000. Their Gen X counterparts, when they were the same age back in 2001, they were making about 42 grand. And then this data goes all the way back into the early 60s. So we can look at sort of the early boomers back in 1982. They were making about $38,000. So yeah, earnings have been kind of flat, not a big increase, but they were doing at least okay in terms of earnings. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and not focus on each individual millennial. Now I'm going to look at a subset of them. I'm going to look at millennials who are running their own households. And so now this is how, for household data, you look at the characteristics of the head of the household. And so now I'm looking at a subset of them, households that are headed by millennials. Okay, their typical, what we call their adjusted income, 2018 was about $71,000. In terms of Gen X, back at the last sort of cyclical peak, they were making about $71,000. And then for our households headed by early boomers back in 1982, they were making about $57,000. So adjusted household incomes, the millennials, those that were running their own household, they were doing no worse than Gen X and actually substantially better than the boomers were back in the early 80s. We can get into the reasons why, but let me sort of move on to wealth. Now, wealth, income, is what's coming in each year. It's what you pay. It's what you pay. It's the basis for your taxes. Wealth is what you have. It's what you've accumulated over all the years, what you've saved up. Formally, it's the total value of your assets minus the total value of your debts. And here we go. This is the Federal Reserve data, the gold standard. The most recent available is 2016. And so households headed by a millennial, their sort of net worth was about median 12 grand in 2016. It was about, for Gen X back in 1998, it was about 15 grand. And for the boomers back in 1983, their total net worth was about 20 grand. And so clearly in terms of wealth, in terms of what they're accumulating, millennials are lagging a bit relative to earlier generations. Just a couple things, and I will turn it back over to you. These wealth differences are not huge, okay? And keep in mind that the oldest millennial still isn't even 40. So they still have quite a few decades yet of wealth accumulation, although COVID-19 very clearly may set them back on that. But when we go into sort of the wealth, it's your assets minus your debt. I've looked at it, sort of what is driving it, these differences between, let's say, millennials and Gen X. We don't have the student debt figures for the boomers back in 83, but a basic difference, it's not so much on the asset side, it's on the debt side. And student debt seems to be playing a significant role. To put some numbers on it, of our millennial households in 2016, about 45% of them had some outstanding student loan debt. The Gen X households back in 1998, only about 23% of them had outstanding student loan debt. So more millennial households relative to the Gen Xers are paying student loan debt, and the amounts tend to be a bit bigger too. This is the outstanding amount they still owe. if they owe student loan debt, the millennials owned about 19 grand. The Gen Xers that had student loan debt back in 1998 owed about 13 grand yet. So part of the reasons millennials are lagging behind in accumulating wealth is they have more likely to have student loan debt, and the amounts that they owe that they've accumulated are greater. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but clearly in terms of wealth accumulation, they do seem to be running behind as of the cyclical peak before COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you for that very thorough overview. Gives us good context going into the rest of our discussion. And now let's turn to Gen Z. We're not talking about the 8-year-olds now. We're talking about those who are adults. What is their profile? What do they care about? And what are their top issues?
Well, we know when we look at them demographically as a group, we do actually want to look at the larger cohorts. So not just the young adults, but going into the teens as well, because something that's going to, I think, define them going forward is the fact that they're the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we've ever seen. A bare majority of them, only 52%, are non-Hispanic white, and that's significantly lower than the share of millennials when they were young. 61% of millennials were non-Hispanic white. So we see a lot of change there. 1 in 4 Gen Zers are Hispanic. Again, that's a historic high for a generation by far. They're less likely than millennials to be immigrants, but more likely to be the children of immigrants, which I think is really interesting. They're also on track to be the best educated generation that we've ever seen. And thinking of the older Gen Zers, they were less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to be enrolled in college. So this is why we say they're on track to be the best educated generation yet. And that will have implications for their job opportunities and their skills and training and all of that going forward. When it comes to politics and policy, they're actually very similar to millennials. So we did a survey about a year ago where we surveyed teens ages 13 to 17 and then looked at 18 to 23-year-olds and combined that so we could sort of get a feel for how the whole generation was feeling about some of the major issues of the day. And again, we find they're very similar to millennials. They're very pro-government. They want to see government doing more to solve problems. And I think that will become relevant now as they assess the way that the government is responding to this current crisis. They also worry a lot about racial injustice. They think that humans are to blame for climate change. And in that way, they're similar to millennials. They're very concerned about climate change. And they're also more accepting of some of the societal changes that are taking place in terms of the family or cultural changes. So an example of that would be same-sex marriage. They're much more accepting of same-sex marriage, Gen Zers and millennials, than their older generations are. And not surprisingly, they're more likely to identify as Democrats. They have more progressive views on other issues as well, and not particularly supportive of Donald Trump and the job that he's doing as president.
Interesting. We just got a question from one of our live viewers. Where does the cutoff come from? How do demographers actually pick 1997 as the cutoff?
Yeah, well, part of it has to do with the fact that we know generations tend to span about 15 years. It was much easier with the baby boom because that was a true demographic phenomenon. It was an actual fertility burst. And it started with the post-war baby boom, and it ended pretty abruptly when the birth control pill became available and fertility rates went down. But other generations, there hasn't been a real demographic driver to the length of the generation. So we look more to sort of historical, technological, cultural shifts that may have defined a generation. So one thing, when we were looking at the 1996 to 97 change, we did have that sort of world-changing event of 9/11 and knowing that Gen Zers didn't really have any memory of that. But another thing that really defines Gen Z is the ubiquity of the internet, social media, and smartphones. So millennials have adapted to all of those technologies as they've come online, but Gen Z will have never known a world where smartphones didn't exist and where they didn't have instant access to the internet. So their experience with technology and the way that they use technology to mediate their interactions with the world is something that I think is really going to define them. And now, of course, we have the coronavirus and whatever the aftermath looks like. And I think that will also become a defining experience for this generation.
Right. Now let's dive into that a little bit of what do you see as COVID-19's impact on Gen Z, because of their age, pretty much all of them are either in K-12 schools or in college, and we've seen school closures across the country. So what do we expect to be the long-term impact, or what are we already starting to see from COVID?
Right. It's really hard to say what the long-term impact will be. I think all of us are just sort of trying to figure this out day by day in terms of how long it's going to last, and when will we get back to normal, and what will normal look like. So, but I think the fact, if you think of where this generation is in terms of the ages that they are, and they're either approaching adulthood or just entering adulthood, these are really formative years. It's upending their educational experience. It's going to have a huge impact on their ability to enter the workforce. We thought that Gen Z would be inheriting a very strong, robust economy, which is something very different from what their millennial counterparts experienced. But now, of course, as we've already mentioned, that's been turned upside down. So the strong economy that we thought they were going to inherit, that it's clearly not going to be the case, at least for the oldest members of Gen Z. We know that in the coming election, 1 in 10 voters, eligible voters, will be members of this generation. So they do have significant political clout at this point, and that's just going to grow as more and more of them reach voting age. In terms of the actual impact of this crisis on their experiences in the economy, we found in a recent survey that 50% of Gen Zers said that either they or someone in their household had lost a job or lost wages because of the coronavirus outbreak. And that was significantly higher than the share that we saw for older generations. So we can see that the immediate job impact has been very severe on this generation. And then we also did an analysis of the labor force, and what we looked at different occupations and industries and how those break down along demographic lines. And we could see that even before the coronavirus outbreak, young workers were very vulnerable because of the types of jobs that they're in. So we looked at high-risk service sector jobs, and we saw that about 1 in 4 employees in those jobs were ages 16 to 24. Those 16 to 24-year-olds only make up about 10% of the labor force, but they made up a disproportionate share of those at-risk jobs. So you can see why so many of them lost jobs early on. So those are a couple of the findings. And then just to sort of contrast them with the experiences of millennials in these same early surveys that we've done, about 4 in 10 millennials said that they or someone in their household had lost a job or lost wages because of coronavirus. So not an insignificant share at all, and higher than Gen Xers and Boomers, but not as high as what we saw for Gen Z. And we also found that only about 40% of millennials said that they have rainy day funds that could potentially carry them through in a financial emergency, such as a job loss for 3 months or more. So both Gen Zers and millennials are being hard hit on the one hand by the job losses, and don't have a lot of cash reserves right now to carry them through. So it's not a great situation.
Mm-hmm. Right. You see these statistics of such a small percentage of Americans in general have a 3-month rainy day fund, and for younger adults, it's usually an even lower percentage. Now we're getting to the point where a lot of these folks may have had zero income for 90 days. So that's a very real impact that's hitting them right now, which you don't necessarily see that direct connection with that statistic. You're not always going to need a 3-month rainy day fund, but right now is one of those times. So are you seeing anything, how are people handling that kind of end of the road, so to speak?
That's going to be something that we're going to be tracking definitely in the coming weeks and months. We do know for the people that we surveyed who said that they didn't have a rainy day fund, we asked them, is there somewhere else you could turn for money? Could you borrow money from a bank? Could you borrow money from family? Could you sell off assets? And only about 1 in 5 said that they would have access to that type of money from other sources such as those in order to carry them through. So that sort of put it into perspective too. So the people that don't have, and that skews, there's a very linear relationship there by age. So older people are more likely to have other sources that they can tap into, and younger people less so. So that makes them, the folks without the reserves are highly vulnerable to just running out of money and not being able to pay rent or access food. And those are things that we're seeing played out in the news for sure.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We have just a couple more questions here in our opening discussion, and then we'll turn to our viewer Q&A. So going back to some of the statistics you mentioned on millennials and Gen Z and education in particular, we hear in the news that millennials are the most highly educated generation ever. 39% have a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 25% of boomers, according to one of your reports that we sent out to our viewers. And Gen Z is on track to be even more so. So but Rick, you had said earlier that despite that, they have lower wealth accumulated than previous generations. So what do you make of that? Is the college wage premium declining, or is it some other structural feature of the economy?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the college wage premium, but what we used to say when Kim and I did this kind of research, say 5, 6, 7 years ago, we would say that millennials are on track to be the most highly educated generation. And what that was doing was comparing how educated Gen X was when they were younger to where the millennials were then. But what I can sort of say now is let's just look at a snapshot of the population in 2019. And it really is true that at a moment in time, the millennials are now the most educated generation. 39% of millennials have at least a bachelor's degree. Gen Xers, 2019, 38% had a bachelor's degree. The boomers, 33% of them had a bachelor's degree. And the silent greatest, 27% of them had a bachelor's degree. So just at a moment in time now, it is true that millennials are the best educated. And as we mentioned earlier, Gen Z early on, if we look at 18 to 23-year-olds, when we look at their college enrollment, high school completion, when we compare them to when millennials were 18 to 23, it's looking like Gen Z may turn out to be even better educated than millennials. So anyway, that's the educational attainment. As far as the college wage premium, what I would mention here, I'll put some numbers on it in a minute, is one way that the millennials are significantly different than, say, the boomers were back in 1980, is that when you ask, well, how's the millennial doing? It's really, really important to say, well, which millennials are we talking about? Are we talking about the college educated ones or the less educated ones? And so here's sort of why. Let's do this. Let's look at a millennial who's running his or her own household, and suppose they only have a high school education. I did income levels earlier, and I'm going to stick with that. A typical high school educated millennial, their household income 2018 is about $49,000. A high school educated boomer back in 82, if they had a high school education, their typical income was about $51,000. So for the less educated young adults, their household incomes have been falling over time. Well, what about the better educated ones? Well, back in 82, if you were a college educated boomer, their typical incomes were about $81,000. But as of 2018, a college educated millennial running a household, their typical household income was about $105,000. So incomes have been rising for better educated young adults, and they've been falling for the less educated young adults over time. And so what you really do see is, at least over the long haul, over the decades, how millennials are faring very much depends on their education levels. And you see a rising college wage premium. Here I'm using not earnings, but I'm using household incomes to sort of show that college still sort of really has gains. We can get into why this is occurring. It partly has to do with who's getting married, and when they do marry, who marries whom, as well as their earnings in the labor market that they earn. But generally, over the long haul, I don't think there's that much evidence that college is a losing proposition for today's young adults. I do think they are relative those that stop their education at high school. They tend to be, the medians, the typical, they tend to be in much better shape.
We have a question from one of our YouTube viewers about inflation. So the wage numbers that you've been citing are all inflation adjusted, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then, but we have a lot of items these days that are increasing costs, outpacing the rate of inflation. You have medical costs, housing costs, education that are outpacing the overall inflation rate. So does that affect what the same inflation adjusted income level actually means in the real world for today's millennials compared to folks 30 years ago?
The quick answer to this is that this is difficult. Okay, there's a lot of discussion among economists as to how to measure changes in the cost of living. What these inflation measures are doing are not focusing on any particular one item. Rather, they're looking at changes in a broad market basket of goods and services. And it's not hard to figure out why this is a little difficult. We know the prices of a smartphone or a computer today, but what were their prices back in the early 80s? Well, those products didn't exist. So you have a changing market basket. And so what the numbers I've given you is we're using the same inflation adjustments that the US Census Bureau uses. We could look at other sort of variations on this, but generally, I would argue, yes, you could look at housing, you could look at some aspects of college tuition. Yes, you could pick particular items that have, substantially outpaced incomes, but when you look at a broad market basket that people buy, those are the sort of results that you get.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thank you. Now let's talk about mental health for a minute. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing high levels of stress for everyone, for some of the reasons that we've talked about. But some surveys have shown that young adults already had a particularly heavy mental health burden before the current crisis started. So what are the statistics on that, and how will that impact them now through the current crisis?
That's a great question. We have picked up on this in our surveys. We did a survey of teens about a year or two ago, and we asked them about a broad variety of issues that they and their peers were facing in their communities, and to what extent these various things were a problem. And anxiety and depression was by far the biggest problem that the teens identified. 70% said that that was a major problem among their peers in their community. And it really outpaced all of the other things, whether it was bullying or drugs and alcohol or teen pregnancy or gangs or school pressures. Everything sort of paled in comparison to this finding. And we didn't have a lot of other research to delve into the reasons why or what types of specific issues teens were facing, but other researchers have really focused on this. And some have even made the link between social media and technology and teens' mental health. And they think that the rise of social media and the pressures that puts on teens has contributed to increasing rates of depression and anxiety, and even increasing suicide rates. So that's not research that we've done because we're not really in the public health space, but this is very much an issue that is top of mind for teens, and I might add for parents of teens as well. And in our research on teens and technology, we have found some pretty eye-popping statistics. So we know that 97% of teens ages 13 to 17 say that they use social media. So that's almost 100%. 45% of teens say that they're online almost constantly. And then another 40-something% say that they're on several times a day. So this is a almost constant thing that they're engaged in. And then we also asked teens, well, what do you think the impact of social media has been on your generation? Do you think it's been positive or negative? And we found there that teens have a mixed assessment. Some say it's positive, some say it hasn't made much of a difference, but a fair share, probably about a third, say it's had a negative impact on their generation. And when we ask them why they think that is, they point to things like bullying and rumor spreading and some of the things that go on social media. And those, again, are things that can cause a lot of stress and anxiety for teens. So it is, again, something that we want to study more in the future. And we're very interested in the impact that this particular situation with coronavirus is having on teens, and the added pressures of losing the social connections that they have from being in school and being active in sports and other extracurricular activities that really give them a lot of meaning and identity. Those things have been taken away, at least temporarily. So we're curious to see what the impact of that will be.
Mm-hmm. We'll be keeping an eye out for your reports on that. We have a question from one of our viewers. Does household income, for Rick, what we've been talking about, does household income include adjustments for retirement plans, pensions, company pensions for boomers versus 401ks paid for by the employee for younger workers?
Okay, the answer would be no, it does not. So what your household income is, it's basically, again, think about your federal tax filing every April 15th. It's basically the flow coming in. So it's for many millennials, it's largely their earnings from their employer. Also, it would include rent, interest, and dividends. It only includes what are sort of called cash sources of income. And so employer provided pensions, or let's say employer provided 401k contributions. So whether we're talking about either defined benefit or defined contribution pension plans, no, they're not sort of counted as part of your sources of income by the Census Bureau. So no, we are not making a statement about that when we talk about the household income figures.
Okay, thank you. Now let's talk about the CARES Act, the coronavirus stimulus package. So this was a $2.2 trillion package. There are going to be more packages, more waves of stimulus, most likely. And all of that is on top of the existing national debt and deficit and the budget deficit. I think I saw someone say that the current budget deficit is on track to be the highest as a percentage of GDP since 1945, which is pretty serious. So how will millennials and Gen Z manage this economic burden in the years and decades ahead?
Okay, so in all to be disclosure, this is not my area of expertise. However, I am trained as an economist and I do follow this discussion. And so I'm going to respond to this by providing just a few observations that economists typically make about this, as well as give it sort of answer your question. I would point out, first of all, for our listeners and participants, that the federal government and the national debt, it's not like you and I, a person's debt. You and I someday will die. We are finite. Presumably the federal government, the United States of America, will live forever, or at least that's how lenders treat us. And so that, let's say in terms of the national debt, the total outstanding obligations of around 100 trillion, that in effect can be continuously sort of refinanced. When it comes due, the Treasury just goes in and borrows again, and presumably, so that 100 trillion principal, it never has to be paid off. They just sort of refinance it. You and I as individuals can't do that. Another sort of thing is that the absolute dollar amounts, the 100 trillion, that's not what to focus on. As you mentioned, you want to focus on what's owed relative to our ability to pay. The country's ability to pay, its economic wherewithal is its GDP each year. And so you're right, you want to measure not just the absolute debt in trillions or the deficit in trillions, it's all relative to our ability to pay, which is GDP. But you're right, that has been on the rise. It is approaching levels that we last sort of approached in the wake of World War II, and it's increasing, and it is a matter of concern. Right now, interest rates are quite low, and they haven't even risen. So in the short term, this is not a matter of great concern, which is why we're willing to do these sorts of large stimulus measures. However, in the years ahead, the economy may get back to full employment, borrowers' interest rates may rise, and so financing that debt and deficit, particularly as interest rates at what Uncle Sam can borrow at, as it starts to rise, it will start to have growing interest burdens. More of our spending will be consumed by interest. And so the way the millennial and Gen Zs are going to handle it is they're going to have to make tougher and tougher choices. their interest expenses will rise, and so something else has to give. And so they will deal with it by having to much more make difficult decisions about how much spending should go to national defense, how much should be spent for the care of the nation's seniors in terms of Social Security and Medicare, as well as how much goes for other priorities. And so they will have a more difficult choices, particularly as we get back to a higher interest rate environment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that concludes our opening discussion here. So let's turn to some more of our viewer questions. We have one from YouTube user Kylie Gutting. Was Pew able to get any data regarding trends in religious affiliation and volunteerism for Gen Z specifically?
For Gen Z specifically, we have done some research on teens and religion, which we haven't released yet. So I can't really speak to that, but we do know that millennials are the most likely to be among the religious nuns, which is the NONES, the group who don't affiliate with formal religion. They're less likely to attend church regularly, to say they pray regularly. They're a less religious generation. And that's even comparing them to Gen Xers when they were young. So it's not just because they're young, it's because there's something markedly different about this sort of movement away from organized religion that we've seen in the US, and millennials are at the leading edge of that. We don't know yet about Gen Z, if they'll represent a continuation of that trend or not, but that's something that we're interested in studying for sure.
Mm-hmm. And what about charitable contributions? Are you tracking that as well?
I don't know of data offhand that we've asked where we've asked about that specifically. I was just thinking when Rick was talking about the deficit and all of that, again, about the sort of pro-government, very progressive set of views that the younger generations have, particularly Gen Z is even more pro-government than millennials are. And I don't know if that translates towards charitable giving or if that's strictly sort of their orientation towards the types of problems that government should be solving.
Interesting. We have a question from Facebook viewer Blaze Caudill. Do we have local data on generational income and wealth? Do we have data on buying power versus just wealth and income?
Okay, I'll field that. Particularly on wealth, we don't collect wealth data as regularly as we collect income data, and we also don't collect it at the level geographic detail. So typically we get, again, this Federal Reserve, the gold standard data. It's a triennial survey every 3 years, and it's only at the national level. Household income, that we get in much more fine detail. The Census Bureau conducts a survey called the American Community Survey. And actually, if you use what's called a combined 5-year file, you can look at county level. You can actually even go down to even lower levels of geography. We, in terms of our generational analysis, we've mainly sort of just followed the national figures, but clearly the data is available to do it at much lower levels of geography in terms of income.
Oh, can I just add on? I'm going to have a follow-up question for Rick on that. Rick, could you talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of population trends with young people moving in and out of different types of communities, rural versus urban versus suburban? Because I thought we learned some interesting things about that. Yeah,
one of the sort of very noteworthy trends about the millennial generations is, and it started a little bit with Gen X, but particularly for the millennial generations, is that the latter decades of the 20th century, in terms of the nation's, call them what you want, central cities, the nation's urban cores, the nation's urban cores, central cities, they were struggling in the latter decades of the 20th century relative to their suburbs. The luster was in the suburbs. One of the major millennial stories among demographers the last decade has been how the millennial generation, particularly the college educated ones, they have really regenerated the nation's urban core. I see it myself when I sort of do go into DC and visit restaurants in some of the neighborhoods in DC. This is certainly true in New York City, Boston. It's even true in a number of the Western cities as well. So millennials have really served to reinvigorate the nation's central cities. What about boomers? What about older Americans? Are they returning to the city? No, they're not. Increasingly, the boomers and the suburbs are aging. One of the interesting questions, and I don't know the answer to this yet, is okay, well, the millennials now, though, they're pushing 39 years old, the older ones. And as they start to form families and have children, are they going to want to continue to reside in the nation's urban cores? That and now there are questions with, particularly with the pandemic and sort of the perception, at least, that more dense areas have had more health issues from the pandemic. One of the really interesting questions going forward, especially in the wake of the pandemic, is whether, particularly the college-educated millennials, whether they're going to head out to the burbs. And we don't have the data to answer that yet, but that's one of the interesting questions.
Right. I'm glad you tied that to what we're currently seeing, because there was just an article about that yesterday. I think that was making the rounds of, you know, are we going to see kind of a flight from density in the wake of the pandemic, or people want a little more space? They don't want to be necessarily packed into a tight city, or are people not going to worry about it? Is COVID just going to, you know, whenever it passes, then does everything go back to normal? So I guess your answer is we don't know yet, but we'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah. And my answer also is that there's the pandemic considerations, but there's also the considerations that, you know, as the millennials get older and have families, and sort of their perceptions of schooling and the amenities of the suburbs versus the urban cores, that also is playing into it.
Right. Definitely. That's a good point. Let's talk for a minute about parents and kids in school. We touched on this a little bit, but one interesting angle I think that not necessarily a lot of people think about is a growing number of millennials actually now have their own children. Even though we're still often confused with those spring breakers on the news, a lot of millennials are pushing 40. So how do you see the COVID pandemic affecting young parents?
Well, I can try to answer that. Right before we hopped on the air, Rick gave me a few statistics about millennials, that 21 million millennial women are moms, and they've had 43 million children. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the size and scope of these family units. Millennials have been slower to marry and slower to form families than previous generations. I think partly because of the sort of slow start they got to adulthood because of their difficulty getting their financial footing early on. But they are forming families. But I think about a third of millennials live with a spouse and with a child, so sort of in a more traditional family setting. And we did some questions just about a month or so ago. So in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak, and we asked parents of school-age children how they felt about their school's response to learning in this school closure, because at that point, I think 47 of the states had closed their schools, and eventually all the states closed their schools. And we found overall that parents were pretty satisfied with what their schools were doing, but there was a fair bit of concern among parents that their kids might fall behind because of this, that they just weren't getting the same type of instruction through online learning that they would be getting in the classroom. And we also found that parents, and these are parents of school-aged kids, were a majority of them said that they were supplementing what their kids were getting in terms of online learning from the schools. They were providing additional resources or additional instruction. And we also know that particularly in millennial families with two parents, the majority of those have two working parents. So that's something that is very common in millennial families. And now that so many parents are working at home and they don't have access to school during the day or childcare, we're curious to know how gender roles in the home might be changing. If moms have to put in a certain number of hours and dads have to do the same, are dads having to do more at home than they would be doing otherwise? This is something we've been thinking about and studying for a long time, and looking at the gradual changes in gender roles in families. So men have over the years taken on more childcare responsibilities. more housework responsibilities as women have begun to spend more time in paid work. But there still is quite an imbalance with women taking on more of the childcare and housework responsibilities, whether or not they're also working for pay. So it'll be interesting to see if those dynamics shift at all going forward, now that a lot of millennial families have had to kind of adjust to this new normal of sharing childcare and trying to get work done at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. We've gotten a few questions. Is there any data on the perceived level of seriousness of the pandemic between generations?
I know we asked people early on whether they thought that the government and people in their own communities were overreacting or not doing enough in reaction to the outbreak. And I'm pretty sure that what we found was that young people were more likely to say that people in their communities were overreacting. So that's sort of a measure of how they see the seriousness of this. But it's interesting that on the flip side of that, as I already mentioned, it was the young people, young adults who were being hardest hit by the job losses and wage losses. But at the same time, they seemed to be bristling a little bit at the restrictions that were being placed on the things that they might ordinarily like to do, like gathering in social groups and going out and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Kim, can you sort of just comment on, we had some survey evidence on concern about sort of the health and the medical aspects of the pandemic versus sort of what the economic and the job market impacts of the pandemic would be. And if I recall correctly, younger Americans had a quite different sort of assessment, right, as compared to older adults, right? Can you just sort of talk about that a bit?
I can't really remember offhand. I mean, my assumption is that younger Americans were less concerned about the health.
Yes,
Because they didn't feel that they were personally at risk to the degree that older Americans did. And I think that that's obviously because in early days, that's probably what they were hearing in the news. But I feel like concern about the economic impact was pretty prevalent across the board, even though we saw the actual reporting of job loss and wage loss being more pronounced among young people.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about levels of happiness between the different generations, outlook on life, aspirational differences. Do you have any data on that?
We do, not anything that recent, but we have looked at happiness in the past, and actually older adults are the happiest people, and that's been consistent over time. There are strong links between being married and being happy. There are strong links between physical health and happiness, and there are very strong links between religious faith and happiness, and that's something that we've found consistently. But when you look at age groups, we definitely see that older adults tend to be happier, which is somewhat counterintuitive. But if you think of those things that go along with happiness, the feelings of having a partner in life and also having a strong religious faith, those are strongly sort of aligned with the aging process as well. Interesting. Yeah.
We have a question about the media habits of millennials. How do they get their news? This viewer, Sheila Carr on YouTube, says, my experience has been that they do not read newspapers. They get their information from Instagram or Facebook or even TikTok.
Yeah, that's absolutely what we have found in our research as well. I mean, the share of young adults that pick up a newspaper is very small, but it's small among older generations and getting smaller as well. But young adults really do turn to the internet for news, and more they get news from social media. And there was an interesting finding when we did this big generational comparison that included Gen Z. We had a question that asked whether the fact that more people get their news from social media is a good thing or a bad thing for society. And most older generations, including millennials, not that they're older, but thought that this was on balance a bad thing for society, that more and more people are getting news from social media. But Gen Zers did not see it that way. There was a real difference there. Gen Z stood out on that measure. And I think it was because for them, that's just how they come across news often and where they get it. So they don't see it as a bad thing. They just see it as sort of, commonplace for them. Whereas older generations, I think, particularly in the wake of the 2016 election, and even since then, the fact that news coming through social media doesn't have the sort of necessarily same levels of filtering and all of that that you get from traditional news organizations or news sources. Older people are more wary about that, but for Gen Z, they don't really make a distinction.
Mhm. Which goes back to your point earlier. If they've just grown up with it, they're familiar with it. It's all they know.
Yep.
I wanted to talk maybe about one of the reports that you recommended for our viewers that we sent out ahead of time. The headline is, "It's becoming more common for young adults to live at home and for longer stretches." And that report or publication is from 2017. But can you address that a little bit, and maybe what is the interplay between that and the COVID pandemic?
Do you want to talk about that, Rick?
Yeah, be happy to. The tendency of young adults to sort of live with their parents, it's actually been rising for many decades, but it particularly sharply rose in the course of the Great Recession. And in the research I did sort of in the wake of the Great Recession, I'm trained as a labor economist, and I sort of said, well, you know, if you can't find work and it's a difficult job market, you rely on the private safety net, one of which is to move in with mom and dad. However, one of the surprising things has been that was in the wake of the Great Recession. Now, as of 2018, 2019, I mentioned I think that the first few years of the recovery weren't very vigorous, but after 2015, the job market really did start to pick up. We had a national unemployment rate approaching 3%. And the thing is that the share of 25 to 37-year-olds who were living at home, it was continuing to rise. And that is not what, if you think it's all driven by a crummy economy, that's not what you expected to see. I think we would have thought that it would start to fall as the economy recovered. It hasn't. And as far as COVID-19, we don't know yet, but at least anecdotally, we certainly seem to think that, again, many, particularly the Gen Z, but young adults some of them have moved back with their parents, and we will sort of see, depending on how first of all, it's not even clear we're in a recovery yet. Things could get worse here quite a bit the next few months, but we'll sort of see how this plays out. So if it wasn't really the job market driving the tendency of young adults to live with their parents, well, what was it? And I'll mention just a couple of factors. There is some evidence, this is not my research, this is particularly with the New York Fed and the Board of Governors. There's some evidence that rising student debt may have played a role, that living with mom and dad was a particularly good way for them to manage their debt, keep their credit scores from falling, and student debt may play a role in sort of why more of them are living with mom and dad. In addition to that, work by Zillow has sort of shown that the metropolitan areas with the highest rents, those are the metropolitan areas where the greatest share of young adults are living with mom and or dad. So some of it reflects housing affordability and rising rents in particular metropolitan areas. I would mention one last factor, though, that sort of is not widely appreciated. Once you sort of get beyond age 24, the 25 to 37-year-olds, well, which millennials is it that are living with mom and dads? It's not the college-educated ones. About 10% of college-educated millennials live with mom and dad, whereas for high school-educated millennials, about 20% of them in the 25 to 37-year-old age range are living with mom and dad. So the business about living with mom and dad, it's much more a phenomenon of the less educated millennials, not the college-educated ones.
Interesting. And you just preemptively answered a follow-up question we had on YouTube of, were people living at home in order to avoid paying rent so they could save for a house? So that was perfect. You answered it right when it came in.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that too? When we did some survey work to sort of support the data that Rick collected on the boomerang generation. And one interesting thing we found there was that, you know, in many cases, the young adult was getting, you know, some financial support from their parents, but in some cases, the parents were also getting financial support from their young adults. So especially during the Great Recession, it was a lifeline for both generations and a source of economic support. It may have been the parent that had lost their job and the millennial child was supplementing the income of the household. And I just saw something earlier this week about during COVID, during the coronavirus outbreak, that parents of millennials are moving in with their adult millennial children because they're worried about their savings or they've lost their jobs. So we see in our research a lot of intergenerational transfers going back and forth. It's not the financial support tends to go from older generations down to younger, but not exclusively.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We have a question about going back to our mental health discussion from YouTube user Jane Lewis. You mentioned 70% of Gen Z identified depression as their #1 concern. Do you have a corresponding statistic for millennials?
No, we don't. That was a survey that we did exclusively of teens, 13 to 17-year-olds. And it wasn't, just to clarify, it wasn't their specific major concern. It was what the highest share said that was a major problem for their peers in their community. So it was sort of their assessment of what was going on with their age group. But we don't have a similar question for millennials, unfortunately. It would be interesting though.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about voting rates and political affiliation. So those are two different questions, but could you talk about what Pew has found in terms of, especially in terms of voting rates? How often do millennials vote, especially the older millennials, since often voting rates are correlated with age? Are we still seeing increased turnout as they get older, or is it not catching up with previous generations?
I think Rick's taken a look at this, right, Rick?
Yeah, I'll handle the voting rates, and I think I'll let you deal with party ID and sort of affiliation. Okay, on voting rates, I have worked on this quite a bit. And up through 2016, millennials were younger. Younger individuals tend to participate less in presidential elections. And so my general conclusion up through 2016 was that, no, there's something about being a millennial that when I looked at sort of how much boomers and Gen Xers turned out when they were the age that millennials were in 2016, millennials were not turning out as much as Gen Xers did when they were young or when boomers did when they were young. And so my general sort of take was up through 2016 is that millennials seem to be, at least in presidential elections, less engaged. Now, that's fine. It was what it was. But when we had the 2018 midterm, and the 2018 midterm basically blew those conclusions out of the water, everyone participated in the 2018 midterm at markedly higher rates, but especially the millennial generation. Their sort of turnout rate relative to the 2014 midterm election, it almost doubled. And so the general take is, in terms of sort of thinking about 2020, the takeaway is that turnout is really hard. It depends upon a number of factors. It depends upon the candidates. It depends upon the issues. It could depend upon the weather. Turnout is very hard, and I think I would be careful about making any prognostications about exactly what turnout might be in 2020. So 2018, they really did turn out at pretty high rates.
Thank you.
And party identification, we do know that millennials lean heavily Democratic, more so than other generations. And the most recent data I could find real quick was in 2017, 58% of millennials identified or leaned to the Democratic Party, and 34% identified or leaned to the Republican Party. And compared with Generation X, they were much more evenly divided. They were 48% Democrat, 43% Republican. And among baby boomers, very similar, 48% Democrat, 46% Republican. And we know that the silent generation leans more to the Republican Party, and the numbers there were 52% Republican or lean Republican versus 43% Democrat or lean Democrat. So millennials obviously skew more Democratic. We don't have great data on the Generation Z and their party ID yet, but the early indication is that they're going to look very similar to millennials and leaning heavily Democratic. And we actually have a report coming out pretty soon, which will be a real deep dive on party identification. And we'll have a better sense at that point about whether to the extent to which Gen Z is kind of mirroring the patterns of millennials.
Mhm. Great. Well, thank you. That was a great conclusion there. We are out of time. So thank you both so much. And thank you to Pew Research Center for co-hosting this event with us about millennials, Gen Z, and COVID-19. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.